But let's just start sort of with the history and the development of our immigration policies, sort of broadly speaking, and what they're designed to do from the perspective of, I guess, like our capitalist economy.
Sure. So as briefly as I can, right, because this history actually goes all the way back to, pre-independence times, where you had the first migrants, which weren't actually called migrants at that point, but indentured servants being brought over from Europe, from Australia, and actually being sold, more or less, not on the same level, obviously, as slavery, but being sold into indentured servitude here in the U.S. So it was literally like early migration was around labor primarily, and the control between early colonies, and then eventually between the states and the federal government. We had this grappling back and forth about who was going to have the say over who came into the country and how. And eventually, this ends up getting sort of resolved as just this kind of greater incident to sovereign power or state power from the federal level. But at all points throughout that history, right, we're looking at things through this lens of ultimately it's a question of control, right? Controlling labor flows or controlling power. Some of the earliest laws around immigration were to protect the sort of hold that the original founding group of folks had over the country, keeping things like anarchists or even just poor Irish people from coming over and potentially usurping some of the early capitalist kind of dominance of the country. Even the abolition of the international slave trade, right, actually wasn't because the Congress at the time was interested in that as a humanitarian aim, but actually was afraid that the recent Haitian revolution might get transplanted to the southern states and get kicked off there. And so whether you're talking about strictly labor concerns or more broadly preservation of power issues, that has always been the case moving throughout our history.
Let's move up into sort of I guess the more modern era of immigration, which I don't know if you would argue, but you definitely said the Coleman Blees. Am I pronouncing his name correctly?
Right, I think that's right. Coleman Blees, yeah, which was the first. White supremacist from South Carolina, passes the first criminalization. So the actual criminalization.
Senator.
Senator from South Carolina. Passes the first criminalization, actual like legal criminalization of migration, which is in its own shape and form still present today, right? And so there's a little known piece of immigration, largely the ones that we know about, right? The context that we're familiar with is that civil piece where people are just trying to stay here in the country, but there's actually a criminal statute for unlawful entries or re-entries where people are charged with an actual crime, end up going to prison and eventually kicked out, right? And so during that same period that gets used, right, to criminalize migrants, to then CBP, the Border Patrol, would actually like take them at times to work on farms. They would donate basically their labor, and then once the agriculturists were done with them, then they would get removed or thrown out of the country, right? So whether we're talking about the civil level or say with Coleman Blees and the criminalization of migrants, we're still looking at that ability to control migration very tightly.
That happened in 1929, and there's two, sort of like, I guess, sort of things happening in 1929. One, we're sort of like in the wake of a reemergence of the KKK and a reassertion of a reassertion of white supremacy, I guess you could say at that time. There's also, we're starting to, head into the Great Depression. And so there is I guess a sentiment of, or there's an opportunity for concern about migrants taking jobs. Can you talk about a little bit about that dynamic and sort of how that, I mean, that really still, both those things are in effect, I guess, 90 years later.
Right, absolutely. I mean, that narrative is the one that we've heard fairly recently is a very old one, that, you were heading in the Great Depression, there are fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer jobs. And at that point, like, there's a great opportunity, especially from the more racist elements and white supremacist elements of the country, to find a scapegoat, right? And so it's not, and when we talk about all of this stuff, it's like, it's not that there was always this sort of clear line of thought necessarily that was constantly guiding. It wasn't a conspiracy, right, at all times to control migrants. Rather, it's like there were just opportunities, such as, once again, we enter the Depression. There's this opportunity to criminalize them because, we don't have any particular use for them right now. So why not look to them to blame them for some of our circumstance and get them thrown out. But then if you go on the flip side of the Depression, right, and entering the World War II era, suddenly there's a massive labor shortage in the country because all of our young men are being shipped overseas to fight. And so we literally didn't have enough people to man factories and the war effort. So Congress then turns around and authorizes the Bracero program, which is bringing massive amounts of labor, largely from Mexico, to come and start tending fields, factories, all of that stuff, right? And in that case, once again, not a humanitarian effort. They weren't allowed to bring their families. It was short-term labor contracts. And as soon as war's over and those needs start to die down, we start seeing massive deportation campaigns again in the late 60s, early 70s.
Can we step back just for a moment and talk a little bit of interject a little bit of theory here and talk, and this from a Marxist perspective, I guess, the critique of our capitalist system, in that there is a tension within the context of a capitalist economy between the idea that you want your workers to be able to afford your product, I guess, as like Ford would say, but also at the time you need to be able to exploit your workers because you need to make a profit. And so where does the immigrant and on some extent you've already sort of explained it in maybe more practical terms, but where does the immigrant, the idea of having an undocumented immigrant, come into that equation?
Absolutely. So there is that tension, right? It's a contradiction within capitalism that it's like, in order to continue accumulating capital against the falling rate, the declining rate of profit, you've got to make up those differences somewhere, right? And immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, are a great way to do that. And we can talk a little bit about how it even happens in the legal immigration context as well. But undocumented immigrants, when agribusiness 5-10 years ago started complaining about massive labor shortages here in the country and their declining profits, what they were actually saying is that we're running out of cheap labor, right? That the consequences of shutting off the border and some of the other laws that had been passed a decade or prior to that, or 2 decades prior to that, we're losing our ability to maintain our profits and continue to provide cheap commodities to the populace, right? We're not able to compete in a global market without these laborers who are willing to work for substandard wages in horrendous living conditions. So when they're decrying these labor shortages in that context, right, what they're really saying is that we're losing our ability to accumulate capital off the back of migrants who are willing to work in these terrible conditions.
Talk about how that also functions in the context of legal immigration, and also, I guess we should also mention the sort of the dilemma that we have about both outsourcing the jobs to, I guess from our perspective, foreign people, but also we have a problem with the jobs staying here and foreign people. There's a sort of a slight contradiction there as well, or at least a dilemma for us.
Yes, absolutely. So to use a fairly straightforward example, the H-1B visas, excuse me, which are skilled worker visas, primarily used in the IT sector, we're bringing large numbers of folks from abroad here to the U.S. to fill supposedly big job vacancies in that sector. Well, of course, if you start to look at the numbers, especially around a few years ago when some of that was on the table and big parts of the discussion in that community, you see that it's like, well, this isn't entirely true. There aren't necessarily this huge shortage of American, and I'll just use that term loosely for the moment, American workers that aren't willing or able to fill those spots. And then if you look even more closely and you find out that, the H-1Bs are supposed to have these protections, that they're paid the same wages as the typical citizen worker, and so that they're not able to undercut the rest, is not actually true. The Department of Labor gives a great deal of deference to the companies to set what the prevailing wage is. So what the companies end up doing, Microsoft, Apple, whoever, Google, get to bring these folks over, pay them way less than
something
they
like
would otherwise pay
40% less, right?
Yeah, sometimes just like categorically just in a whole other tier of pay, which is of course for those folks in many countries is still a great deal more than they were making in their home country, and we can come back to that dilemma. But then at the end of that time, whether that's a year, 2 years, 5 years, the company is under zero obligation to sponsor that person for any kind of permanent residence. So essentially they dangle the person's legal status over them, and if they complain, they start to organize anything at all, they can just cut off their contract and they're out, they're gone, right? So it's the use of the law, the convolution, its complexity, its enforcement mechanisms to ensure that migrants sort of stay under thumb that way when it comes to maintaining profit and pay. Now, of course, some leftists, Angela Nagel comes to mind, right, of talking about sort of that U.S. protectionism or Western protectionism, and saying we should be actually for closed borders because it's protecting local workers and local people from experiencing those kind of wage undercuts, right? But that is exactly the kind of in my opinion, regressive and almost reactionary thinking that's only going to set us further back, right? Instead of looking to how the populations abroad might be undercutting wages, we should instead be turning our focus to instead look and say, okay, but why? Why is it that we are seeing these migration patterns, or why is it that capitalists need to undercut folks at all, and instead focusing in on the fact that it's like, no, the people who get to make these decisions, the folks that have the power over this, that is where we need to turn our focus to.
I mean, it raises the point that when we think about, HB1 visas, how those laws get made. I mean, it's not terribly dissimilar from our tax codes largely, which is the corporations who have the greatest interest in this deploy the greatest amount of political pressure through lobbyists and through other programs. And, even if you have lawmakers with the purest of intentions, which I'm only saying for the sake of argument,
sure.
That the shaping of these laws reflect the desires and, according to them, needs of these corporations, and their need is to get the cheapest amount of labor they possibly can in those instances. There was I just saw a tweet in regards to sort of the notion of where we're going to cut off unemployment benefits we have for workers with the hopes that, you have businesses saying like, there's a shortage of labor here. And they made the point that like nobody goes into a car dealership and says, I I want to buy an Audi, but I only got like $6,000. There's a shortage of Audis. I can't find one. It's because you're not paying for it, and that there's that dynamic to it, folks. There's more of what you've just saw where that came from. That's if you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you. Really, thank you.